του Κέντρου Φιλελεύθερων Μελετών. Καλησπέρα σας. Είμαι ο Αλέξανδρος Κούρας, είμαι ο πρόεδρος του Κέντρου Φιλελεύθερων Μελετών, Μάρκος Δραγούμης, και είναι μεγάλη μας χαρά που βρισκόμαστε σήμερα εδώ για ένα ακόμα Masterclass. Θα συνεχίσω στα αγγλικά, διότι ο καλεσμένος μας δεν γνωρίζει τη γλώσσα μας. I would like to welcome Dr. Kristin Nimitz in this live webinar, where we will be discussing about a very important book that he wrote. And the Greek audience recently had the opportunity to find this book in the Greek language. I will be sharing a screenshot of the book as it is in Greece. Σοσιαλισμός, η αποτυχημένη ιδέα που ποτέ δεν πεθαίνει. Socialism, the failed idea that never dies. That was the title we gave, and I think it was true to the original. Right, Kristian?
Not something that I can judge, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I'll just take it from you.
Yeah. So the purpose of this webinar today is to obviously discuss the book, but also raise some questions and take your view on how this COVID crisis is going to impact and maybe will revive socialist ideas. But before I go to that, I would like to tell our friends a little more about today's speaker. Dr. Kristian Nimitz is head of political economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. The Institute of Economic Affairs in London is a very important organization that we, as ΚΕΦίΜ, we are joint members at the Epicenter network, and I believe we have a few folks joining us from there as well today. We have a strategic partnership with the IEA, one of our movement's most important organizations for a number of projects, including our publication project with Φιλελεύθερος newspaper. So a lot of the books that the Greek audience has the chance to purchase every week belong to that partnership that we have with the IEA. Our guest speaker today joined the IEA in 2008 as Poverty Research Fellow, becoming a Senior Research Fellow in 2013, Head of Health and Welfare in 2015, and Head of Political Economy in 2018. He studied economics at the Humboldt Universität in Berlin and the Universidad de Salamanca, graduating in 2007 with his MSc in economics. During these studies, he interned at the Central Bank of Bolivia, the National Statistics Office of Paraguay, and the Institute of Economic Affairs. In 2013, he completed his PhD in political economy at King's College London, and previously worked as a research fellow at the Berlin Institute for Free Enterprise and at King's College London, where he taught economics throughout his postgraduate studies. He's a regular contributor to various journals in the UK, Germany, and Switzerland. Kristian, it's a great honor to have you here with us today, and the floor is yours. Tell us about why this failed idea, this idea failed, and why it keeps coming back.
Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question. First of all, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to talk about the curious revival of socialism. Last year, there was an edition of The Economist, which was titled The Rise of Millennial Socialism. And a couple of weeks later, there was an edition of The New Statesman, which had, I think, an almost identical title. And then the New York Times and the Financial Times were using this expression as well, millennial socialism. Those publications all, as you would expect, disagreed in their assessment of the phenomenon, with The Economist being mostly critical of it, the New Statesman being very much in favor, the New York Times somewhere in between. But they all agreed on one thing, which is that millennial socialism is indeed a thing. It is really happening. There is a revival of socialism, and it is mostly a generational project. It is especially pronounced among the millennial generation, although not limited to them. It is not just a social media hype, not just a social media bubble phenomenon. It is something that is really happening, and you can see this in plenty of surveys. For example, about half of American millennials say that they have a positive view of socialism. Now, in some cases, this is a linguistic confusion. In some cases, these are people who think socialism means something like universal healthcare, or socialism means helping students with their tuition fees, something like that. But that is not the whole story here, not by a long shot. There are, in the same survey, they also repeat the same question, but using less ambiguous terms. They ask the same question about Marxism, with the term Marxism instead of socialism, or communism instead of socialism, less ambiguous terminology. And yes, if you phrase it like that, support drops, but not nearly by as much as you would think. You still get about 1 in 3 American millennials, or slightly more than that, approving of socialism. And it's very similar here in Britain, where, for example, in one survey, about 2 out of 5 millennials said that, or agreed with the statement, communism could have worked if it had been better implemented. About the same proportion say that they have a positive view of socialism. They associate socialism with a lot of positive things, such as fairness, justice, and so on. And what I find worrying about surveys of this type is not so much the fact that there's a lot of approval for socialism, that there are a lot of people who agree with socialism as an ideology. It's more that there are very few who actively disagree. You could, of course, say, well, okay, that's 35% or 40%. That's still not a majority. That's true, but that is simply because most people are generally apolitical in every generation. So therefore, this if you get an approval rating of 35 or 40% for socialism, this doesn't mean that 60 or 65% are anti-socialists. Actually, if you look at the people who don't actively agree with that statement, you'll at their responses, you'll find that most of them don't actively disagree with it either. They just give non-committal answers. They say, I don't know, or I don't have an opinion on this. I neither agree nor disagree. And this means that if you look specifically at the people who do have an opinion, there the pro-socialists outnumber the anti-socialists in a ratio of at least 2 to 1. There are very few people who actively oppose socialism or actively endorse liberalism or capitalism. That is my main issue with these surveys. I don't per se have a problem with the fact that we have lots of passionate believers in socialism. It's more that we have very few passionate opponents of socialism, very few people who passionately believe in something else, in liberalism, in capitalism, in free markets. That is the main issue with this phenomenon. It's not that, it's not like, say, the Brexit arguments that we've had here for a long time now, and that we're still having to some extent, where you have people who passionately believe in Brexit and people who passionately oppose it, but you have clearly 2 sides fighting it out against each other. That's not what's happening in the socialism versus capitalism debate. There you have all the passion, all the enthusiasm being completely on one side. You have lots of very passionate socialists. You have almost no passionate liberals. You have a situation that I would compare to the situation of British Eurosceptics maybe 10 years ago. That was a time when Euroscepticism was not a mainstream cause in Britain. It was still a minority phenomenon. However, there were plenty of passionate opponents of the EU, plenty of people who passionately advocated what we now call Brexit. It wasn't the word then, but that's what it was. But you had almost no one on the other side who passionately believed in the European project. So that is more the relationship. You have lots of people who believe in one cause, and then many others who are just indifferent. But you don't really get much of a debate here. That is what we really mean by the revival of millennial socialism. That is mostly, it's not that this is necessarily a project of a majority, it's more that it is largely unopposed. And that raises the question, how can an idea that has been tried so many times and that has failed so many times, how can that still be so popular? Because we've had really no shortage of socialist experiments over the past 100 years, starting with the Soviet Union, then the whole of Central and Eastern Europe, Maoist China. We've had Vietnam, various experiments in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa. It's been tried on every continent. There have been so many attempts to build a socialist society, at least 24, not counting the very short-lived ones. In fact, some people go even further back, and then they count the kind of pre-Marx socialism, the sort of socialist communes that existed in Britain and America in the 19th century. However you want to define it, it is a long series of catastrophic failures. So how can such an idea, after so many failed attempts, still be so popular? And a big part of the answer has to be that socialists have long been very good at distancing themselves from real-world examples, real-world applications of their ideas. And this is something that you all know from your own discussions with socialists, that as soon as you mention any real-world example, whether that is the Soviet Union, whether that is Maoist China, whether that's Vietnam, Cuba, North Korea, or nowadays Venezuela as well, the answer will always be, oh, come on, now you're just being silly. That is obviously not the kind of socialism that I'm talking about. I want a completely different kind of socialism. I want a democratic socialism. I want a non-elitist, a non-hierarchical socialism, a socialism in which the working class rules the economy, a socialism in which the people are in charge and not a party elite, not a technocratic elite. That's always the argument. And it seems that socialists so far are managing to get away with that, although good luck trying to do the same thing with any other philosophy. That nobody else really gets away with distancing themselves in such a way from all real-world approximations of their ideas in action. There's only socialists who have that luxury. Now, there are a lot of problems with this argument that all these previous attempts at socialism were just somehow not really socialism, but perhaps the problem that stands out most to me is that this is an argument which historically has only been made retroactively or almost exclusively retroactively after the event. What I mean by that is that socialist projects always go through a period during which they have some initial success, during which they are in their prime and their international standing is relatively high. And that's always a time when you will be hard pressed to find someone who says that's not really socialism. It's always once it has already been widely discredited, that is when Western intellectuals, Western socialists suddenly say, oh no, that wasn't really socialism. That's not what we're talking about. You just don't understand it. This is something that always comes up in hindsight, but it's not an argument that is commonly made as long as a socialist project is in its prime. In fact, most socialist projects, if not all of them, have gone through this honeymoon period, a period during which they were widely endorsed by lots of Western intellectuals, and usually quite prominent Western intellectuals. I'm not talking about obscure fringe groups. I'm not talking about some communist party with 10 members and 12 voters. I'm talking about well-established mainstream academics. And this has been the pattern for quite a while, for, well, about 100 years now. In the book, I go through various examples, but it's by no means exhaustive. These are just the high-profile examples, or the examples that I've been that I've found most material on, but it isn't limited to those. It all started with the Soviet Union. That was the first major attempt to build a socialist society. And nowadays, most socialists would treat the Soviet Union as some massive betrayal of their ideas, something that had nothing to do with actual Marxism, something that was a perversion of the original ideas. That wasn't always so. In the 1930s, it was actually very much a mainstream argument to be in favor of Soviet socialism. Stalinism was very popular among Western intellectuals at the time. You had literally thousands of Western intellectuals, Brits, Americans, French people, who were traveling to the Soviet Union on guided tours, who were shown factories or some Soviet committee meeting, and who then came back totally starry-eyed, saying, "I've seen the future. They're building a new society, and this is all wonderful." This was really a mainstream opinion at the time, that the Soviet Union was a new kind of society, the first attempt to build a worker state, and it was widely defended by prominent intellectuals. Again, I'm not talking about some fringe groups. That would be easy, but that would be cheating. I'm not engaging in that. I'm talking about people who were quite well-respected intellectuals in their time. In fact, some of them are even quite well remembered today. You have, for example, the Webbs, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who are co-founders of the New Statesman magazine, of the London School of Economics. They were some of the leading figures of the British left at the time. Or for the American left, you have Walter Duranty, who was the New York Times columnist. He is the one who coined this famous phrase, "You can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs." These were all high-profile figures. These were not some obscure fringe figures with an audience of 12 people. These were some of the leading intellectuals of their time. And what happened is that these people in the 1930s, of course, were not just any period in Soviet history. That was the grimmest period. That was the absolute worst period in Soviet history. It started with the Soviet famine in the early 30s, the forced collectivization and the de-kulakization program. And then you had the Stalinist terror with millions of people being sent to gulags, mostly on trumped up, fabricated charges. And you had, across the board, Western intellectuals defending all of that, even the worst aspects of it. For example, there was one debate in the British Parliament at the time, because there was a group of British engineers who were caught up in one of these purges. They were in the Soviet Union on some engineering project. And there was a massive purge in the sector in which they worked at the time, and that they got caught up in it. They were accused of espionage or sabotage, something like that. And you had people in the British Parliament defending that, saying, well, look, if the Soviet authorities say that these people are spies and saboteurs, surely it must be right. The Soviet Union is a worker state. They would not just accuse people of a crime that they haven't committed. And again, these are no obscure figures that leapt to the defense of the Stalinist regime. These were people who, some of whom would later become cabinet ministers. So some very high-profile, high-ranking politicians were very much part of this pro-Soviet left at the time. This only really came to an end with the beginning of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union became the enemy. That was a time when it would have been ridiculous from a socialist perspective to be seen as pro-Soviet Union. That would have been a total PR disaster. So that was when they started to roll back. And then a couple of years later, this episode of this flirtation with Stalinism was largely forgotten. And that is how, in retrospect, Soviet socialism became not real socialism in hindsight, because then in the 60s, you had a new generation of socialists who had grown up and who had no memories of this earlier attachment to the Soviet Union. That was not their project. And they said, no, this has nothing to do with me. They just could distance themselves from Soviet socialism in that way, saying this is obviously a perverted version of socialism. That's obviously not what Karl Marx had in mind. And that's how that came to an end. But it was for a very long time a mainstream cause. And now then in the 1960s, the same thing happened again. It's just that this time there were new utopias, the utopias du jour of the 1960s, where Vietnam, Cuba, and of course China under Mao Zedong. That was probably the most popular one, and this was very much part of this 1968 student movement. If you ask anyone who went to university in a Western country in the late 60s, they will tell you about this, that this was the fashion at the time, that you had to be pro-Mao, pro-Ho Chi Minh, and this was a thing from California to West Berlin, all over the Western world. That was the big thing, and you had in particular lots of French intellectuals who idolized the Chinese regime, the Vietnamese regime, people who traveled there, big names such as Jean-Paul Sartre, who were absolutely at it and who were defending the great cultural revolution and all that. It was only after the death of Mao that Maoism became a bit of a joke, became associated with sectarianism and fringe groups in the way that we see it today. But throughout the 60s and early 70s, that was absolutely a mainstream cause. Maoism, Ho Chi Minhism, being pro-Cuba, those were the socialist utopias of the day. And very few people said, no, that's not really socialism. That, again, is something that came in retrospect. That came after the event. Then in the 70s, you had 70s and 80s, you had a couple of less well-known examples where you didn't have mass pilgrimages, but you still had a certain circle of Western supporters. You had, for example, North Korea. North Korea had its Western fans for a while. You had, for example, the American Black Panther Party. Some of their leading figures traveled to North Korea and came back and said, this is real socialism, this is brilliant. A couple of projects in Africa, Tanzania, and so on. Even Zimbabwe for a while. You had Albania was popular for a while, Cambodia even under the Khmer Rouge. It was often these isolated projects which were bloc-free, not associated with the Soviets or the Chinese, where you could therefore say, oh, this is a completely different type of socialism. They have a project of their own. This is the real thing now. In the 1980s, it was Nicaragua. In Central America, you had lots of Western intellectuals, again, idolizing that and traveling there and trying to build that version of socialism. It was only in the 90s and early 2000s that, for the first time since the Soviet mania, you had a bit of a break. That was the only time in which there wasn't at least one example that Western intellectuals would widely praise as the real thing, as the model socialist society. And what filled that gap is the most recent example then, in the mid-2000s, Venezuela became the next big thing. In fact, I remember the start of this quite well, of Venezuela mania, of Chavez mania. There was, I was an undergraduate student at the time. I remember you could suddenly see Venezuelan flags popping up everywhere. You had student societies inviting speakers from Venezuela, trade union leaders and so on, and that became extremely fashionable. And it didn't take a lot. It was just this change in rhetoric that they called their version of socialism, socialism of the 21st century, or 21st century socialism. That was a phrase that Chavez used, and that was all it took. It turned out just putting the words 21st century into it, just using that modifier, was enough to purge the word socialism from all its bad 20th century association. I remember having these debates at university where people said to me, look, Nimitz, you just don't get it. When you think socialism means something that means the GDR, you're so old-fashioned. It's got nothing to do with that. Socialism means what's happening in Venezuela. That is the real thing. That's the socialism of the 21st century. This is completely different. And then after the death of Chavez, we had the same process of rowing back that happened in all these previous projects, that once it was past its prime, the former supporters were suddenly either falling silent or just rowing back, denying their previous statements. You had lots of prominent figures here on the British left in particular. It was figures such as columnist Owen Jones and Jeremy Corbyn himself and his whole entourage, his shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, John McDonnell, and his main advisor, Seamus Milner. People like that were extremely pro-Venezuela. They traveled there several times. They were visited by Venezuelan delegations, and that was the big thing for a while. Once the Venezuelan economy started to come tumbling down and collapse, these people were suddenly silent. And then a couple of years later, you got the same circle of excuses saying, come on, Venezuela has nothing to do with socialism. You just don't understand it. And just this complete amnesia for forgetting or whitewashing this fairly long history, lasted for about a decade, this history of endorsing this regime. And this is what's been going on now 400 years, and I'm sure this was not the last time. There will be future Venezuelas. There will be some project of that kind again in the future, and it will have these three stages again. It will have this honeymoon period of widespread endorsement. It will have this period of dithering and looking for excuses when it collapses, and it will then one day reach this stage of that was not really socialism. So this is something that's been going on for a while, and it seems like we never really see through this pattern, and socialists get away with it time and again. Now this raises a question for liberals, for supporters of the market economy, which is, what do you do about that? Because clearly that seems like a debate which we can't win. I think what we have to do, and it is an uphill battle. It's mostly, the problem at the moment is that socialism is simply considered quite hip. It's fashionable to be a socialist. It's for a lot of people, it's a fashion statement, and that's very hard to argue against. That's not something that you can refute with economic statistics. But I think a case that is worth making is simply to remind socialists of how similar they sound to the people who endorsed these previous projects, and ask them, what makes you so sure that you are so totally different? If you just show them, look, this is what people used to say about Chavez in the mid-2000s. This is what people used to say about Mao in the late 60s. This is what people used to say about Stalin in the 30s. This sounds like you. What makes you so different? That would be the right strategy, because socialists make the mistake, and I think in most cases it's an honest mistake, that they look at these real world socialist projects, they see how they turned out, meaning they turned out as horrendous dictatorships, extremely technocratic and hierarchical. You had a small elite in charge oppressing the vast majority. You had regimes that made a complete mockery of this socialist idea that socialism means the working class collectively, democratically running the economy. And they see these outcomes and they jump to the conclusion that this must all have been deliberate. It must have been that these regimes just either misunderstood Marxism, they just didn't understand what a socialist society was meant to look like, or they were just cynically using that name socialism without actually believing in it and actually just being interested in their own power. But either way, the assumption is that socialist projects simply turned out that way. simply turned authoritarian, simply turned oppressive, because the people in charge wanted it to be that way. It was all intentional. And that is completely untrue. That is not what happened. If you look at the writings of prominent socialists and even socialist dictators, the things that they wrote before they came to power, it never sounds totalitarian. It's not that these people started out with the intention of building totalitarian societies. That's just never what happened. Now, you could say, yeah, talk is cheap. Dictators don't normally say literally, I want to be a dictator, I want to kill millions, I want to be oppressive and horrible. Nobody says that literally, but it isn't just that people opportunistically joined a socialist project because they thought, oh, this would be an easy way to come to power. Most of the famous socialists joined socialism when it was absolutely not a winning cause, when it seemed like a hopeless cause. You had even someone like Stalin. Stalin spent most of his early life either in prison, in exile, in forced exile in Siberia, or just somewhere hiding from the Tsarist police as an underground activist. He was, as horrible as he was as a human being, you can accuse him of many things, but you cannot accuse him of being just an opportunist. He really believed all this stuff. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sacrificed his early career and all his early life. These were people who did passionately believe in their cause and joined it long before they had a realistic chance of coming to power. When Lenin and Stalin joined what would later become the Bolshevik Party, it must have seemed like a totally hopeless cause. That was a small underground project that was persecuted by the Tsarist police. Lenin himself spent many years in exile. And then you get the same story if you look at pretty much any of the future socialist leaders. Mao Zedong was also an underground fighter. Fidel Castro, of course, Che Guevara. The reason why we use this term guerrilla fighter, that we use the Spanish word here in English, that probably comes from the Cuban experience. That they were partisan fighters. The future Cuban government, they were not a political cause that was in vogue and seemed like a realistic prospect of coming to power. They were underground fighters. They were persecuted. You had people like Erich Honecker, who would later be the man who carried out the construction, who oversaw the construction of the Berlin Wall, and the future leader of the East German Socialist Party. This was a man who spent something like a decade of his life in a Nazi prison, or various Nazi prisons. He used to be an anti-fascist resistance fighter. Again, not an opportunist. Horrible man, absolutely, but not someone who you could accuse of cheap opportunism. These were all people who did believe in their cause and who really did think that they could build the kind of socialist society that Marx had described. In Lenin's early writings, or actually later writings, from just before he came to power, you can see this very clearly. He doesn't talk about anything that sounds like the Soviet Union. He talks about a kind of workers' democracy. He imagines the construction of a socialist society as something very easy. He imagines it to be almost like the abolition of slavery, where you don't need a detailed plan of what happens afterwards. You just abolish the institution of slavery as such, and the rest then takes care of itself. He thought of the abolition of capitalism in very similar terms. He thought of capitalism as, well, literally wage slavery. That's the term that they used. And he just thought, well, once you kick out the capitalists, the workers take over, and that's that. That's all there is to know. He doesn't talk about 5-year plans or a Soviet bureaucracy or his own party running the show afterwards. That was absolutely not the idea. These people always started with the intention of building working class democracies. It just never turns out that way, and it cannot turn out that way. That's always been the liberal argument, and that's the argument that we have to to make again. It's something that we've forgotten how to make, because for a long time we just didn't need it. It wasn't necessary, because there were very few prominent self-described Marxists, not people with a large media profile in the West, but they are here again. And we have to learn to make that argument again. Liberals used to be very good at this. This type of argument has a long history on the liberal side. You had Eugen Richter in the 19th century, who was a German liberal. He wrote a book in the 1890s called Pictures of the Socialistic Future, in which he described a society that's spookily similar to the way the Soviet Union actually was to what it was actually like later. You had, of course, Ludwig von Mises writing in the 1920s, when there wasn't really an example of socialism yet. The Soviet Union technically existed, but that was before their first 5-year plan. It was not yet a proper, the socialist transformation hadn't really started yet, and he more or less foresaw the reasons why it wouldn't work. And of course, the road to serfdom. Hayek in 1944, this was when socialism was really just the Soviet Union. This was before he had the benefit of being able to observe this again in all over Eastern Europe, and then in Cuba and in Asia, before he could observe what would happen later in Vietnam, in China, and all these other places. He already predicted how it turned out, and he knew that this was happening for very systematic reasons, that you cannot just undermine or abolish market processes, market signals, market prices, property rights, and hope that a society will somehow spontaneously organize itself. If you abolish or override market forces, then coercion and force is pretty much all you have left. You cannot realistically run a large-scale modern economy in a democratic way. You can do this in an Israeli kibbutz on a small scale, when you have 200 people and a small agrarian commune with a simple economy. There, yes, that's possible. You can run that in a democratic way. You can have these 200 people gathering and talking about discussing the next harvest. That is, in a meaningful sense, a democratically run collective economy, but it cannot be scaled up. That is the point. Even in Israel itself, the kibbutzim, the largest ones have something like 1,000 people. That seems to be pretty much the absolute maximum. These projects, the kibbutzim, have existed for 100 years. They've never found a way to scale that up, to make this work on a big scale, make it work not with 200 people, but with 2 million people or 20 million people, or let alone a society, a modern Western society, a country like Britain, 65 million people. If they've never managed to make it work in all these years, I very much doubt that our millennial hipster socialists today are the ones who are going to make it work. And I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Kristian, for this wonderful presentation. And I'm sure that you taking a historical approach helped a lot of people to understand the main point of your book, and also of your study of socialism. I'll give you a few things for context, just so you know a little bit about the audience you're speaking to, in case some little known facts about Greece. So besides the fact that we constantly have a communist party in Greece in parliament, they usually get about anywhere between 5 to 8% of the vote. And they are Stalinists, right? They believe that Stalin was right and he was not bad and all that. Greece also has a Maoist party, a Leninist Marxist communist party, but also a Marxist Leninist communist party.
And there's even a full package. Great.
Yeah, and there's even a party for the reorganization of the Communist Party.
Okay.
All right, so you're talking to a group of people who have had their fair share of communist ideology in their surroundings. However, as a result of the Greek crisis, socialism is not trendy anymore in Greece, and Greece is an exception to that. And there are a lot of reasons that may have led to that. but it's a trend that we've been following very closely, and we're happy to be a positive exception in this. I'll ask everybody who has a question to use the Q&A tab on your Zoom browser or the Zoom app if you have it, to post a question. We already have a couple of those, and I have some prepared. And I'll start with this one. I think at the most fundamental level, the reason why socialism keeps coming back, as you described, is that they're able to find the new example, the new shiny example of the new socialism. And I think that if we look at this bird's eye view, the one critical element is that it's always in fashion. You touched that upon your presentation, but I'd like you to tell us a bit more. Why do you think it's always in fashion? Why is it so fashionable to promote socialism? Why do people find it so acceptable, and all they need is a new example in order to rally behind it?
Yeah, well, if I knew the answer to that, I would be more effective at doing something about it, which so far I'm afraid I'm not. I don't know why it's fashionable. Fashions are just hard to explain. They cannot be launched deliberately. It's just that a lot of you always get early adopters, early movers. In this case, it just seems to be the case that a lot of fashionable people have adopted it, and others are trying to imitate it. It's become fashionable in a way that a craft beer brewery becomes fashionable. You got some early adopters and some high status individuals, and then you have lots of others trying to follow it. So, but I realized that that's a bit of a tautological answer, because then you could say, okay, well, then why do these early adopters find it fashionable? Why do they adopt it?
Does that lead to, at some point, that Hayek's Intellectuals and Socialism, perhaps, as a possible answer to that?
Yes, I guess he was not talking about. Yeah, this is hard to judge in hindsight. He wasn't talking about the kind of hipster socialism that we see today. He talked about how British intellectuals had just given up on liberalism and endorsed socialism. He said his argument was that what they liked about it was exactly this dreamy character, that socialists didn't at that time come with a specific example. This was when they were moving away already from the Soviet Union, and that it was highly speculative. That's something that appealed to intellectuals. Liberals were talking about improving the existing system, and that's something that that's inevitably will always sound a bit technocratic. There you're just talking about improvements within the system, but you're not talking about something dreamy and utopian, whereas the socialists were able to do that. They were talking about a type of society that didn't exist yet, and where they had to speculate, where there was a demand for explaining how this or that would work in a socialist society. There was no example, and it was something where which appealed to intellectuals' sense of creativity. It was a bit of a challenge to imagine, how could a socialist society deal with this? How could a socialist society deal with that? And he said that was something that appealed to them. It was simply exciting to speculate about future socialist societies. And he said liberals have to be able to do something like that as well. They have to be able to make it exciting to be a liberal. And another case that Hayek made, although I think that was in a different publication, and maybe this partly answers your question, is that socialism seems to be in our DNA a bit, in the sense that our moral intuitions are socialist. It's something that you can quite easily become a socialist without having read Marx and Engels. You don't have to read Das Kapital in order to be a socialist. It's just something that appeals intuitively, whereas liberalism is quite counterintuitive. I don't know anyone who on my side of this argument, on the liberal pro-market side, who was always a pro-market liberal. This is not something that you just naturally grow into, but lots of people were initially socialists or something else, and then over time become liberals. This was, I think, true even of Hayek himself and Mises. I think they had a brief period of flirting with socialism. And the reason why it is in our DNA is that there is this theory in evolutionary psychology that our moral intuitions come from a time when our hunter-gatherer ancestors used to live in small tribes for hundreds of thousands of years. That is when our moral intuitions were formed. And in a setting like that, you have a kind of proto-socialism. Even Marx, I think, made that case that this was an early primitive communism, and he thought, well, all we have to do now is do the same, but with industry, with railways, with steam engines, with big factories, with division of, he wasn't keen on division of labor, but otherwise with the big industrial power that capitalism has created. But there's always been this idea that you can easily extrapolate from the small setting to the large society. That's the leap that socialists always make, and they don't seem to get that that's fundamentally different. What works at a small scale between a group of 100 people doesn't work when you have 1 million people. What works when you have some very simple activity doesn't mean when you have a complex economy with a complex pattern of division of labor, lots of intermediary goods, capital goods, where it isn't just about going out and hunting a mammoth, where it's about producing intermediary goods with lots of stages of production and much greater levels of complexity, where you just need market forces to coordinate that activity. But that's a very counterintuitive case. It's I used to teach economics for a while, and market mechanisms are something that when you explain it, I always emotionally resist it at first. This is quite hard to get across, because you always have someone who wants to say, yeah, well, you can show this here with your graphs, but come on, this is unjust. And it just seems to go against our grain, market economics.
So, and another thing that we notice with this recent trend of hipster socialism is that many socialists now, they kind of like find refuge at the Scandinavian model, which, you know, with our knowledge of the Scandinavian model, it's not socialism. Does that mean they've lost? Is it like they're saying, okay, we'll settle with a market economy with big redistribution? Or do you think they're just waiting for the next Venezuela, Bolivia, or, you know, whatever example they're waiting for?
Yeah, I don't really know where this fascination with Sweden comes from. It could just be a hangover from the 70s or 80s. There was a time when Sweden really was halfway towards socialism. Modern Sweden, of course, isn't like that at all. I used to believe for a while that in a lot of cases, just a misunderstanding that maybe these people just misunderstand the Swedish economy. And once you explain that actually Sweden is a capitalist country, they just have higher taxes than we have, but they're not less capitalist necessarily than Britain or America. But I don't believe that anymore, because my experience is that if it was just that, you would expect that once you point this out, occasionally somebody would say, "Ah, really? Is that how Sweden works? I didn't know that. In that case, I'm not a socialist." But this never happens. It's once you do point out that actually Sweden is a pretty liberal economy, and that Sweden is not remotely socialist, that it is a social democracy. Of course, it's not small state liberalism, but it is just liberal capitalism with a big state. No socialist changes their mind. They would then say, yeah, well, I'm not saying we should be exactly like Sweden. I'm just using that as an example from which we can learn some things. But of course, there are other things where we have to go far beyond that. And the more outspoken, the more articulate socialists, don't do that in any event. This is more the sort of hipster who superficially flirts with socialism. They would say, oh, but look at Sweden. But if you look at the people with a high media profile within this socialist movement, none of them would say we want to be like Sweden. In fact, I've come across quite a few, for example, people from the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, who quite specifically define themselves against Nordic social democracy. These people would say, yes, Swedish-style social democracy is a bit better than Anglo-Saxon capitalism. It's a bit better than what exists in the US or in the UK. But they also say very explicitly, I don't want to adopt this model. This is just a slightly nicer form of capitalism, but it still isn't a democratically run economy. And that makes sense. If you're a Marxist, you believe that everything's about class power. And these people argue that Sweden still has a capitalist class. They like some of the gains, some of the redistribution that's going on in Sweden, but they would also say Sweden still has a capitalist class. The capitalist class is still in power, and they can roll back these gains that the working class has enjoyed whenever they like. This is, they might acknowledge some of the upsides of that model, but they'd also say these gains are unstable, you can't rely on that. Ultimately, what you have to do is move towards a type of economy where there just is no capital class at all anymore. And that definitely is not Sweden.
Let me go to the questions from our audience. So the first one has to do with the current pandemic and the health crisis that we are all facing. Could this be used as, do you see this being used by socialists as a way to argue on the benefits and importance of national healthcare systems?
Yes, but that I don't specifically have a problem with, because I'm a liberal, but in areas like healthcare, I'm not a free market purist. I'm okay with some government activity in the area of healthcare. I think the government should make sure that healthcare is universal and accessible to everybody. I just do not believe that you have to do this by nationalizing the healthcare sector. The way to do that is not the way we've done it here in Britain with having a state-run healthcare system. It would be something much more like in Switzerland and the Netherlands, where you have market-based healthcare. You just have subsidies for people who can't afford their health insurance premiums. You have a discrimination ban. Health insurers cannot discriminate against people with against bad risks,
pre-existing
health,
conditions.
Yeah, pre-existing conditions and all that, exactly. And in that way, you can have a largely market-based healthcare system which is still universal. That I have absolutely no problem with. It's slightly strange that in most developed countries have universal healthcare already. That's really not hard to achieve. That's not a big deal, and you don't need a nationalized healthcare sector here. That's why I find it slightly strange that organizations like the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, that they are so obsessed with this Medicare for all single payer plan. Why would they go for something which in their context, in the American context, would be quite difficult to implement? Why don't they go for something that, given where they're starting from, is much easier, which would be the type of Swiss-style, Dutch-style universal health insurance model, which some American organizations are advocating, the Commonwealth Fund, despite the fact that they are fairly, I think, left-leaning, but that's an argument I've seen them making, saying, look, if we want universal healthcare, we just learn from Switzerland, we can learn from the Netherlands, we don't need a total revolution.
Next question. So where would you place Bernie Sanders' democratic socialism on the socialism spectrum? And a follow-up from the same question that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Do you think that social democracy has been discredited in the same way that communism or, command controlled economies have?
Okay, on the first question, I don't follow American politics closely, so that I can't say. I don't know where you would place Bernie Sanders specifically. I follow some of the thinkers around him, and so I mentioned the Democratic Socialists of America. The people whose publications I've read, their former, I think, chairman or vice chairman, don't know exactly, one of their former leading figures has written a book called The Socialist Manifesto. He is definitely a socialist in the proper sense. And he's honest about that, for fair play to him. He's one of those people who very clearly say, I absolutely do not want to be like Sweden or Denmark. I want socialism. And he's clear about what he means by socialism. He means a collectivized economy. He means collective ownership of the means of production. And he says this doesn't have to mean 5-year plans. You can have just worker cooperatives. You can have something like market socialism, but like in Yugoslavia. But he clearly doesn't believe in capitalism with a large welfare state. In fact, he looks at Sweden and says, yeah, they were doing the right thing in the 70s and 80s, but then the capitalist class fought back. That's his Marxist interpretation. That's not what happened, of course. The reality is that Sweden had an economic crisis in the early 90s, and then Sweden being the Swedes being a pragmatic bunch, they just realized, right, this doesn't work. We'll abandon this. We move to a more capitalist economy. But these guys, being Marxists, they cannot see this as anything other than a fight back of the capitalist class, and that's why they ultimately distance themselves from Sweden and say we don't want to be like that. Whether you can extrapolate from them to political figureheads like Bernie Sanders himself, I don't know. I think he's been going back and forth. He sometimes does this "we just want to be like Denmark" thing, and also then at other occasions says something more radical. Maybe that's deliberate. I don't know. But in any case, specific political figures don't really matter that much. This isn't about this person or that person, which is why it doesn't really matter that much that Bernie Sanders is now no longer really happening. But I don't think that really matters. There will just be someone else. That doesn't have to be a political candidate. There will just be it will just become more of an extra parliamentary thing. It will be like Extinction Rebellion. They're not a party political project, but they're nonetheless very influential, and that's where I see the future of socialism as well. So that's why I don't specifically follow these political figures. I follow more the people around them, the thinkers around them, and that would be the Democratic Socialists of America, or in Britain, Momentum. I'm not sure what the Greek equivalent would be, but I'm sure there's something. And those are the people who I would follow. That's, I guess, a very Hayekian approach. Hayek wrote The Intellectuals and Socialism. He didn't single out any person. For him, this wasn't about Clement Attlee or any of the British politicians of that time.
I'll bundle a couple of questions together. Could you provide us with some examples about the failure of capitalism that socialists use? So in the same way that we use their failures, maybe they make better arguments why capitalism has failed and they keep coming back. And another one is, this brings up a matter of how do we speak about these issues internationally? What our friend asks, what about the people who define themselves as socialists, meaning not communism, but mostly social progress, social progressives and stuff like that, public sector economy and workers' rights and many of socialism's claims, but not the full package. And this brings up a whole other question, is how do we as a movement of ideas speak about this internationally, right? We are not consistent with the terminology we use. Liberal means a different thing in Europe than it does in the US. It actually means quite the opposite. And socialism in Greece, for example, means by default social democracy. It does not mean communism or completely centralized economies. How do we go beyond the semantics and make sure we're talking about the same thing?
Okay, on the failures of capitalism, I'll bundle that with the earlier question of whether the current pandemic is going to strengthen socialism or be used by them. I think what happens here is that once socialism is intellectually dominant, everything that happens in the world, every bad thing that happens in the world will somehow be interpreted as a failure of capitalism. That's why within days you have people saying the coronavirus is really a failure of capitalism, coming up with that assertion first, and then you can just always fill it with some reasoning. It's mostly post hoc rationalization, of course, but you can always do that if you look for an excuse, if you look for a reason to believe that this would somehow not have happened under socialism. You can always find that.
Although it happened in communist China, by the way, it started.
Yeah, they would then say that that's because they've moved away from the real thing, or they never were the real thing. No, but then this always happens, and I wouldn't waste too much time addressing the specifics of this. But this is more that you have a general intellectual climate that's hostile to capitalism. And once you have that, pretty much anything that happens in the world will somehow be interpreted as a failure of capitalism. That's why there are, at the moment, it's a very common socialist argument to claim that climate change is the big crisis of capitalism. Lots of socialists make that case. Environmentalists, I mean, this is now, they're nowadays more or less the same thing, socialism and environmentalism. And this is actually a totally bizarre argument, because if the Soviet Union still existed today, surely they would have an absolutely massive carbon footprint. Climate change, carbon emissions are simply a byproduct of production. It has nothing to do with what economic system you're talking about here. It absolutely doesn't matter whether your carbon emitting factory is privately owned, whether it's owned by the state or whether it's owned by a worker cooperative or something else. It's completely independent of that. It's just that you have this pre-existing hostility to capitalism, and therefore everything that happens in the world is somehow interpreted in that light. I see lots of people here in Britain who somehow make the case that capitalism causes racism. A completely bizarre argument, because clearly racism has existed in socialist societies. This has just existed and can exist in any type of society. But what I'm saying is, if you look for it, you can always somehow construct a reason to make yourself believe that. In this case, the reasoning they come up with is that the capitalist class deliberately creates racism in order to pit various sections of the working class against each other. They turn the white working class against the minority ethnic working class and so on. And in the same way, you get people claiming sexism is caused by capitalism because the capitalists are turning the genders against each other. And you can just construct anything as a problem of capitalism if you look at it in that way. That's just very easy to do if you're already hegemonic, and socialists unfortunately pretty much are. The second question was about terminology. That I don't see as a massive problem. If it is the case that that in Greece people call themselves socialists are not socialists in the proper sense, then I would say then okay, then that's not a problem. I would not start arguing about terminology if they advocate something that isn't socialism but insist on calling it socialism. Then I would say fair enough, call it whatever you like. If you want to call white wine red wine, that's fine by me as long as I know what you mean. It really isn't the semantic that bothers me here. And that's why in my own book I don't spend a lot of time with definitions. I just describe what I mean. If somebody else means something else by that, then I would simply say, well then okay, then this book is not about you, then ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Kristian. And this was a really enjoyable discussion, and we learned a lot during your presentation. We'll do a shameless plug of our new book club right now in Greek. Be well, and thank you so much for all the hard work you're doing at the IEA and for the amazing book that readers had the chance to buy for the second time this past weekend. As a bundle with the newspaper Φιλελεύθερος, whom we also thank for their collaboration. Επιστρέφω στα ελληνικά. Σας ανακοινώνω σήμερα ότι και η συνάδελφός μου, η Αλώνα, θα ανεβάσει ένα poll, ένα ερωτηματολόγιο για εσάς, άμα θέλετε να σας ενημερώσουμε προσωπικά για την νέα μας πρωτοβουλία. Το πρώτο διαδικτυακό book club του ΚΕΦίΜ. Ξεκινάμε με 6 θεμελιώδη βιβλία για την ελευθερία. Κάθε Τρίτη από τις 9 Ιουνίου μέχρι και τις 14 Ιουλίου, από τις 6 μέχρι τις 8, το ΚΕΦίΜ διοργανώνει το πρώτο του διαδικτυακό book club με τίτλο 6 θεμελιώδη βιβλία για την ελευθερία. Στο πρόγραμμα θα παρουσιαστούν και θα συζητηθούν οι βασικές ιδέες 6 εκ των πλέον σημαντικότερων φιλελεύθερων τίτλων που έχουν εκδοθεί στα ελληνικά τα τελευταία χρόνια, τα οποία είναι τα εξής: Ο δρόμος προς τη δουλεία του Φρίντρικ Χάιεκ, Το περί ελευθερίας του Τζον Στιούαρτ Μιλ, Η προέλευση του χρήματος του Καρλ Μέγκερ, Ο αντικαπιταλισμός του Λούντβιχ φον Μίσες, Καπιταλισμός και ελευθερία του Μίλτον Φρίντμαν και Ο κοινός νους του Τόμας Πέιν. 6 βιβλία, 6 διαλέξεις. Το κόστος συμμετοχής στο πρόγραμμα αυτό είναι 90 ευρώ, με μια έκπτωση της τάξης των 20 ευρώ για τα μέλη του ΚΕΦίΜ, νέες και νέους μέχρι 26 ετών και ανέργους, και περιλαμβάνει τη συμμετοχή σε σεμινάρια, την αγορά των 6 βιβλίων και τη δωρεάν ταχυδρομική και έγκαιρη ταχυδρομική τους αποστολή. Σε κάθε σεμινάριο, ο υπεύθυνος των εκπαιδευτικών προγραμμάτων του ΚΕΦίΜ, ο Γιώργος Αρχόντας, διδάκτορας πολιτικής φιλοσοφίας και οικονομικής θεωρίας και εντεταλμένος διδάσκων στο τμήμα Πολιτικής Επιστήμης και Διεθνών Σχέσεων του Πανεπιστημίου Πελοποννήσου, μαζί με διακεκριμένες και διακεκριμένους καλεσμένους, θα παρουσιάζουν το βιβλίο της εβδομάδας και θα συζητούν γι' αυτό με τους συμμετέχοντες. Με τη συμμετοχή σας θα αποκτήσετε και θα μελετήσετε συστηματικά 6 από τα σημαντικότερα βιβλία για την ελευθερία που κυκλοφόρησαν στα ελληνικά τα τελευταία χρόνια, σφαιρική γνώση των βασικών επιχειρημάτων ενός ευρέως φάσματος φιλελεύθερων στοχαστών, την ευκαιρία να συζητήσετε για τις ιδέες της ελευθερίας με έγκριτους φιλελεύθερους και ειδικούς στοχαστές και να εχνηλατήσετε τις προοπτικές περαιτέρω εμβάθυνσης στη φιλελεύθερη σκέψη. Δεδομένου ότι ο αριθμός των συμμετεχόντων είναι περιορισμένος, συμπληρώστε έγκαιρα την αίτηση συμμετοχής, την οποία θα βρείτε αυτή τη στιγμή στο site του ΚΕΦίΜ και στα social media που έχουμε ανακοινώσει το πρόγραμμα, και με την ολοκλήρωση του προγράμματος φυσικά θα δοθεί πιστοποιητικό παρακολούθησης. Για περισσότερες πληροφορίες επικοινωνείτε μαζί μας στο info@kefim.org για να σας απαντήσουμε σε οτιδήποτε άλλο θέλετε. Σας ευχαριστούμε και για τη συμμετοχή σας στο σημερινό Masterclass. Kristian, once again, I didn't notice you stuck with us, but thank you. We appreciate it. We appreciate you and all the good work you're doing. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.
Γεια σας και εις το επανειδήν.